Okay, so today's tutorial we're going to be doing a ball bouncing tutorial, and it's pretty simple. If I go into 3ds Max and press the play button, this is what the outcome should be for the project. You can see there's a little bit of stretch and skew, and the bounces are pretty well timed, and everything looks pretty good. So today's tutorial we're going to be showing you how to create a bouncing ball. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is open up Max and start a new file, and you'll probably start in the perspective view. And so what you should do is press the F key, and you'll go to the front view. And when you initially start it up and you go to the front view, it might be in wireframe, and so you're going to want to change that to shaded or consistent colors, because realistic will give us shadows, and we don't want that. Or the possibility of shadows. When I tried it, it gave shadows, so. Okay. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go to the Create panel. It's the first panel up on the left side. Well, the far right side, but it's the far left panel on that side. Little orange icon here. And you're going to go from Geometry, and you're going to go to Shapes. And you're going to click on the Shapes tab there and go to Splines. And then you're going to create the ground. We're going to create the ground. So we're going to make a rectangle and just click and drag across the bottom here. And you see that right now that I have the outsides outlined, and I believe that is, nope, that's not, is it? I don't know if that's F4 or not. Okay. So yeah, we just created a rectangle, and I don't know how to turn those off, but that's okay. What we need to do now is just adjust it so that it's long enough for how big you want your bounce to be. I'm gonna make it that tall, or a little bit taller. Doesn't really matter because it's the ground. And then make it as long as you want. And I feel comfortable with that. So what I'm going to do is going to go back up to Select Object icon up here and click on the rectangle. And you can see you can't really see it. It's just the outline because it's just a spline. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to right click and convert to an editable poly. And what that does is it makes it so it's a face. And the way to see that, I don't know how to get it to show immediately, but to get it to show afterwards is to just go to polygon, and it should pop up. And so now you know it's there, and we made it. So click off of polygon to get out of subobject mode. And now we're going to want to create a bouncy ball. So we go back up to Create and go to Splines and go to Circle. And it should be right down from Rectangle. And just click and drag, make it as big as you want. And you'll notice that when we first make the circle, if you zoom in on it close enough, you can start to see it has like these ugly shapes to it. Like it's sort of not as round. Now, of course, that's I wasn't seeing it, of course, because my thing was at 20. Because I've been doing this before. But by default, when you spawn it in or when you create it, it will look like this. Typically, should be like 6 or something, and that's not what we want. If you can see the difference from what I just zoomed into to now, you can see that this is just that's horrendous. That's not going to do. It's not going to fly, especially when it's filled in. You're going to notice it a lot more. It's going to look like a 16-sided stop sign, and it's not really that good looking. Additionally, when you're in this modify tab, when you're modifying this spline, you can set the parameters, and in case you didn't make the circle the right size the first time, you can go into your parameters and adjust the radius, and it's very helpful. I'm just going to leave it at whatever. Let's put 2. And bring up that the steps, which are found in interpolation. Going to bring those steps up to 20. And now that we have everything we need, like it's looking just right, what we can do is we can right-click and we can convert to an editable spline. And the reason we do that first instead of just going to poly is because when you convert to poly first, a lot of weird stuff happens, I'm told. We try right now. But we're going to want to speed things up a little bit, so let's just go with spline. And then we'll go with poly. And then it disappears, right? Wrong. So we just go to polygon, click it. Here it is. Awesome. Then click off that. Now we got our circle, we got our ball, and we have the ground. Okay? So the next part is to move the ball to the starting position of where you want the ball to start the bounce. You could picture it's almost being dropped off of a counter, or somebody's throwing it or something, and then you base that off. You base where you're going to place it off of that. And so we're going to set that up here, and I'm going to move the cursor down here on the timeline. There's a cursor with a giant, it has numbers on it that usually just say the frame number that you're on out of the total number of frames in the timeline, which you can adjust manually. And to do that, I believe it's just time configuration, and you click, and you can adjust your time that way. And I'll just go with 100 just because that's a nice clean number. Nice even number. So we'll go with that. You go all the way back to the beginning here. And we want to set it so that we can see where the ball is going. Like how we've set up the ball, and to check to see that it's going in a straight, or a believable path. And to do that, we would go up to the 4th tab on the right, which is past, create, and modify, and hierarchy. It's called motion. And we click on that. And then what happens is when you first open this, it should be set to just parameters. And you're just going to want to click trajectories. And now, when you move it into the second part, when you move it on the second, in a second, I'm going to move it, and you're going to see that it's going to have a line behind it. So what we're going to do before we move it, that's why I was hesitant. Before we move it, we want to set the auto key. And this just basically, this mode ensures that the computer is recording what we do to the objects in the scene at any given time, and on what time in the timeline that is being done. So It's very handy for if you don't want to have to set every single key manually and instead just move the object from point A to point B. Typically what I like to do is also to set keys manually as well as using auto key. Usually at the beginning of a movement or before a movement changes, before the object changes to another shape or to another movement, which we'll get into later in the demo or in the tutorial. So what we want to do is, with auto key enabled, just click set keys, and you'll set the first key on the timeline, setting it at 0 or 1 if you don't want to set it at 0. And then we just go a little bit further down on the timeline to frame 10, let's say, and bring the ball down to the ground. And that's where the trajectories are coming in. You can see how it's following, as I move the ball, it's following the ball. And those little dots represent the other frames on the timeline. So those frames, this would probably be like frame 8 or 9 or something, and these ones would be going backwards towards frame 1. And it shows that, you know, if I played that backwards, you can see now it's going from frame 1 to frame 10 in that trajectory line. So it's very handy when we need to see where the ball is going and like need ghost paths or something, you know, like to understand. And so now we're just going to go to frame 20 and go up, bring the ball back up to about halfway. I don't have to be exact. You can eyeball it if you want. But, you know, typically you want to keep it around half, because as the ball, as you bounce a ball, it loses a lot of its momentum from moving around and from colliding. So it's going to lose that energy that it had when it was on the first downstroke or the downward path. So now, coming back up, you only go about halfway. And you can apply that to the rest of the bounces throughout. And go 10 frames and go up about halfway, like that. Again, you don't have to be exact. Okay, looks about good. And then halfway again. And you do this about, you're going to do this about 5 times, 5 or 6 times, depending on the height of your bounce and depending on how far you want it to go. And how bouncy you want that ball to be. Like you could make these so that this is like that, and then when it bounces, it's like that. You know what I mean? So the bouncing trajectory is it's wider than this one. We just go like this. I think just one more should do it. Go back down to 90. And at the end of that, once you get to the 100, I believe all that happens when a ball is getting close to the end of its movement, it will not bounce, but roll. And so I can put a little bit of a roll there. So just make it go like that. And let's see what that looks like. Now, if we go to the end here, you can see that the reason that that roll was such it pulls it so quickly is because you have these 10 frames to move it that far, right? So what we could do is just instead move it a little bit closer so it's about the same path for those two. And so therefore it takes the 10 frames to actually settle instead of having to move farther, because if it moves farther, it'll go faster. And what you'll notice right off the bat here is that it doesn't look natural. It looks like it's intentionally following a path. If you can see this, you can really tell because near the bottom of each path, there's a whole bunch of clustered dots. And that's basically like telling the ball, it basically means to the ball that it's going to slow down on those because there's more frames in that small space. And on that rounded slope, there's more frames. And so the ball is going to take longer to do that task of bouncing, when really all it is it's just bang, like super fast. And so to really speed that up, we can go into the curve editor and we would go to the bottom of the blue line curves, and I believe these represent the Z position. Yes, they do. So we just go to the Z position and just click on the bottom points on this chart, and just set tangents to linear from the top selection here. We get auto, we get the spline, fast, slow, stepped. But for this tutorial, we're just going to make it like a bouncing ball. So we're just going to have a straight path, straight to the ground and straight up. Just 1 point. And we're going to do that with all the other points. And then minimize that or close it. And now when we play it, it has a more natural flow to it. The bounce is sudden. And it's quick. And the top, we don't need to adjust the top necessarily yet, or remove, like in the same manner that we did with the bottom ones. We don't have to change the top, because when a ball bounces, it does actually kind of hang around for a couple more seconds than when it's on the down, compared to the actual hit on the desk or on the ground. It's a lot more like it's called hang time, I believe, where it just kind of hangs there for a second and comes back down. And then we can see that across all these. And one thing you'll notice, though, as we play this, is the farther ones here, they're taking a lot longer than the first ones. It's almost like the ball is going in slow motion near the end. And if you'll notice, that's also because there are a whole bunch of frames. Because we space these all out at 10, there are a whole bunch of frames that have now become a part of this arc, and they take up more space than these ones, because these ones are spread out. So it's not as slow for the ball to follow these points. But because there's so many points here, the ball is going slower because it has to follow all those points. And so really easy way to alleviate that, or to give the illusion that the ball is actually going similar to these ones, is to just pull these frames back. So we're going to look at where the first part of this is. So I think it's right about here probably. And we're just going to bring these frames back a couple places. I brought this one back 3, and I brought that one back 3. And let's bring these ones back. Like this. So we get 77, 87, and 93. Okay. So let's take a look. So bounce, 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 bounce. And actually, I'd like to keep the last one at 100 because that's, that's the final roll thing. So you can see that this one was improved a little bit, this arc right here, but this other arc is still kind of too slow, and if you can see it, it's still because, look at those. Look at that big jumble of frames. So we're going to just go back here, find out where it starts, and it starts between these two, obviously. So we're just going to bring this one back to like 73 or 72. And if you notice that, now look at that, boom. It's almost the same as that one, if not a little bit less. And then just bring this one back. And then just have it roll, I guess, for the last little bit. So bounce, bounce, bounce. One thing to also notice, to note, is that these trajectories, if you look at the halfway, like it's not just halfway vertically, it's also halfway horizontally. And so this one versus this one, I think this one should be increased and these two should be increased too. So we can also update those ones. And to do that, we would just go back to these points on the timeline and just move the ball slightly, and that will adjust the points on the timeline. We could also do it in the curve editor, but it's I feel it's better to do it on the actual stage, because then we can see what's going on. We can see how it translates. And we keep going here. And I'm not quite sure if that's half. I know this one looks like it's half. Now this one could probably needs to go a little bit more. So move that. Move that. Move that. Yep, that doesn't look too bad. And of course, don't forget that last frame. Now if we play that, looks like a fairly decent ball roll. And now, of course, yours might look a little bit better than mine. You can adjust it as much as you'd like. Obviously, play around with it. Play around with the different curves and all that, and see what they do to the actual trajectory of the line. Okay, now what we're going to do here is we're going to add a little bit of exaggeration to the bounces. Now that we have the general idea of the structure of the trajectory of the ball, we're going to exaggerate the bounces. And so this is fairly simple. The method that I use is almost somewhat convoluted, but it helps in the case of like of something with like if you make a translation on the 9th frame or something like that, you make like a rotation or something. And what I found is that that rotation tends to affect this frame up here, this one at the very beginning. And the reason is because there was no keyframe here beforehand, before the translation took place. And so now that the translation, instead of having to happen just between these couple of frames, now it happens and it pulls this one in and it pulls these ones in too. So I think it's effective. So let's try it. What we want is we want to set keyframe 2 frames away on either side from the collision, or the bottom frame, like the phase where the ball is connecting with the ground. So we go back to like the 8th frame and set a key. And then go to the 12th and set a key. And we play that, nothing really changed there. We just have some extra keys inserted. And this is where we go and make this ball. We use stretch and skew. And by default, this tool up here will be a uniform scale tool. And we don't really want it to be uniform scale. And this is non-uniform scale. And I'm not sure exactly what this one does different than that one. Probably non-uniform scale, I guess. But we're just going to use the squash tool. And it really makes it, makes the ball really stretchy. Like cartoony, like Goofy or something. So we're just going to stretch them out, really exaggerate that collision, and actually move it down too, to collide with that. And then what we're going to do is also have it, so we go back a frame, or back to this frame, I believe, and go back to this tool, the squash tool, and then we're just going to stretch and then rotate. And so what you get is you get this frame to this frame is going to be like that, that sucking motion, like so it's pulling it down, forces of gravity, pulling it down. It comes in, hits the ground, and then it goes back up. And this frame here helped us so that now it turns back into a normal ball. And I'm certain, let's try this for a second. If I go like that and tilt it, yep, that's what I was talking about before, is if you don't set the keyframes at certain parts, then if you were to change the dimensions of the object or change the rotation, that now follows the object for the rest of its trajectory. It almost looks like an egg. So we don't want that. And so what I'm going to do actually is just set the keyframes then at every top point. And just set a key. And that way when I adjust this one and pull. And just so you know, I'm using keyboard shortcuts to do these quick manipulations of the ball. R will get you your scale, so your squash and your stretch. E will get you your rotate, so you can line it up with the trajectory. And then W is your more traditional like movements and stuff like that. Okay, so now it comes in, bounces, goes back up, returns into its form, and then set a couple more keyframes here. And also one at the top here. And make this so he's not like that. Make sure that it's squash. And he's like that. Bring him down onto the ground. And then for this one, stretch. And you don't have to exaggerate it as much as the first bounce because it's not as powerful. So you don't have to exaggerate that. Just make sure that you rotate it with the line of trajectory so it looks a little bit more convincingly cartoonish, I guess you could say. Bounces. And this one, this would probably be our final one that we're going to exaggerate it. And then these ones, it would be so subtle, it would be a waste to actually do that, I feel. But you can, if you want, and see exactly how far you can push it. You can make your ball like all bubbly and stuff, and it's just always transmorphing and all that. And just stretch a little bit. And then like that. And hold on a second here. Oh, what's going on? Okay. I'm just backtracking because I adjusted this one first. And I realized you shouldn't adjust the side ones first. You should adjust the middle one because the side ones involve rotations. And they'll mess this one up because this one doesn't have the that like that option. Like it doesn't, we didn't save that memory piece because you see, if you can see like these keyframes, they all remember a certain aspect of the object. And I believe these ones, the red ones, just remember position of the object. And blue, I believe, is a stretch or a squash or something like that. So it's only going to remember that, right? Because if you can see how I adjusted that and I made it a squash, and you can see that that is blue and red. So it's the movement and the actual squash. Whereas these ones are, because I set them manually, these actually pretty much, they get every single thing about that object and keep that in the memory. So if anything's changed in a second frame, it still has that on that frame. So now we just go to the left and right of that keyframe, stretch slightly, and tilt. Move over, and then stretch slightly and tilt. And now the rest should just be really subtle. And another thing we can do to touch this up is we can play with the top trajectories of the lines. And so we just go to the curve editor. You can see there's a big mess here. So we're going to go to Z position, back to that. And the reason that was a big mess was because you had these lines for rotation, and you also had the scale, and that's all going everywhere. So we're just going to focus on the Z position here, which was the bounce. And we're just going to go to the tops of all these bounces and just pull it out on both sides slightly, not too much. Although you can try doing a little bit more, and I believe all it will do is make it have a little bit more hang time. And you just do this with all the slopes. And now we play it, we'll have a little bit more of a hang on here. A little bit. It's subtle, but it's a little bit more of a detail than before. And then what you can also do is, other little touch-ups to it as well. Obviously, I realize that this point here is not low enough for an actual... Here, let me see what that looks like. If I scroll through there and stop there, that one actually appears to be hitting the ground. And I think the reason that one is higher up, these two are higher up, is because these ones were in squash, and so you had to bring them down. These ones at the bottom here were squash, so you had to bring them down so that they actually look like they connected with the ground. Okay, and that's basically the tutorial for making a ball bounce. You can add more to it. You can put your own spin on that. You can do whatever you want. It's cool. It's awesome. Yep. Be making more videos, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.